as authors, and hopefully one day as myself as a future author, and those who are called the imagers of God, we create, and by doing that, we mimic God. Uh, when it comes to your work of storytelling, either in through verbal ways or written ways, uh, how much of your characters in your novels represent who you are, your faith, your flaws, your virtues, your passions, your struggles, anything of that sort? Because for me, it's inevitable when I'm writing that I will include in some of the characters, maybe even multiple, some of my stuff. It can be humor, it can be nerdiness, it can be sarcasm, it can be anything, good or bad. So just curious,
Mm.
how much you as imagers of God, how much are you investing from yourself when you're building characters and thus making them in your image? Maybe Daniel, you can start.
Sure. Yeah, I think um, there's no way to get around writing yourself into something that you're creating, because just like God creating the world, he's sewing bits of his character into everything, you know. Hence why the Bible talks about him in anthropological language, or is using symbols or metaphors or allegories for God. That's because it's woven into everything, and you can't really talk about him without using everything to talk about him. You know, um, with me writing a story though, it's a little different because we're always creating worlds in our heads. You don't have to be a fiction writer to create a world in your head. Everyone has a narrative that they put onto life for themselves. Some of them make themselves the hero. Some of them make themselves out to be the villain. Some of them make themselves out to be a complete background character who doesn't really have much importance. And there's not always a right answer, but um, there's always a narrative going on in people's heads. That's something that God gave us, for better or for worse, and for a lot of times it's for the worst. That people invent a world for themselves that doesn't correspond to reality. Um, for myself, making a world is a really joyful process that exposes a lot of my flaws as I do it. And I think earlier, Zechariah, you mentioned people's flaws, characters' flaws being their most compelling feature. That does ring true in a way, because it resonates, and it also is true to the author. You're kind of getting to the heart of the author, because you're like, oh, there's this kind of dealing with what is inside here. This isn't just trying to paint the best picture possible. You're presenting a world that I'm familiar with already, a world that already has conflict in it, and a world that um, there's evil in it, and oftentimes uh, in places that you thought it wouldn't be. You know, um, I think those are the most compelling stories, and those are the most true to life depictions. Writing myself into characters, I try to avoid doing that explicitly, because I don't think that would make a very compelling story. I think the writer of a story is kind of like the cameraman of a movie. He's presenting you the story, and he's presenting you the world from a particular angle, and he's telling the story, but you never see him. And if he presents himself, it just kind of ruins the whole experience. It breaks the immersion. So I try to avoid putting myself into a character. I guess that'd be my answer. Yeah.
All right, so that is definitely an interesting question, and I've seen. Uh, yeah, I think there's always little bits of aspects of you that kind of slip into characters. Like, I'd agree with Daniel that like a full self insert. I think that would kind of throw me out of the story. I think and that would probably throw other people out of the story. But I think there are like little shards of reflections of yourself in various characters, and shards of your perspective of other people, which is still kind of you that you're putting into characters. I think one of the big tools of a writer isn't necessarily creating something out of nothing. It's being good at remixing things. So when you're making a world, you say, let me start with this piece of culture I know, and then I put in this other piece, and then I mix them together. I make them something that seems entirely new. And I think that's what we're also doing with characters. I definitely see some of my flaws in some of my characters, and that helps me write some of their emotions in ways that can resonate more because I've been in some of those places emotionally or mentally. Whereas if I'm trying to write things I haven't experienced, I can't connect on quite that level. Sometimes, for instance, I've written a character, I've taken some of my beliefs and then I've ramped them up to 11 and taken them to an extreme lens, which does lend itself to comedy. So I don't agree with this character, but in some way they reflect something about my worldview.